welcome to the National Shrine of Our Lady of Good Health, Michael O'Neill, the Miracle Hunter.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here today. And I felt so lucky because I was able to be here on December 8th, 2010, when Bishop Ricken had that Mass and gave his solemn approval of the apparitions here. And it seemed like there were more people at Mass today than were in here in 2010. So that's great news that the message of Our Lady of Good Help is spreading and that devotion is increasing. So that's really wonderful. So today we're celebrating the anniversary of the first apparition of adult to adult bliss, and also, of course, October 13th is the 100-year anniversary of the Sun Miracle of Fatima. So this is the perfect opportunity to talk about miracles today. And so at the end of the talk today, I welcome you to ask questions, or you can visit me at my book table in the gift shop. I love getting questions. Every week on my Relevant Radio show, I answer one question of the week, so send your questions my way. But I'll save you one question that I always get, which is, how did you turn into this miracle hunter guy? People ask that one all the time. And this one, like a lot of good things in life, came through an inspiration of my mother. So we have this little miracle story in our family. And it happened when my mother was growing up. She was about 8 or 9 years old. And it so happened that her mother, my grandmother, fell away from the Catholic faith and not only stopped going to Mass, but began to become anti-Catholic. She threw away all the rosary beads in the house, threw away the statues, and began to make fun of her own children, saying, "Why do you believe in these things?" And so, of course, for an 8-year-old child, that was heartbreaking. And so my mother began to pray for the intercession of Our Lady of Guadalupe. And like any good Catholic does, she made a deal with God. She said, "God, if you bring my mother back to the faith, I promise someday to become a school teacher when I grow up, and on every December 12th, I will tell them the miracle story of Our Lady of Guadalupe. And if you bless me with any children, I will tell them on December 12th the story of Our Lady of Guadalupe." Well, can you guess? I heard that story a lot growing up. And I'm continuing that tradition, telling about Our Lady of Guadalupe. But my grandmother came back to the Catholic faith shortly thereafter, and she died just a couple of years ago as a good Catholic in good standing with the Church. And she taught us children growing up how to be Catholic. So that miracle took place in our family, and we still talk about it even today. But when we talk about miracles, there are so many different things we can talk about. Some miracles are big and some are small. We all have these miracle stories of a lost wallet or wedding ring or keys. And we might say this is a miracle or this might not be a miracle. But when the Catholic Church talks about miracles, there are so many different things. When we talk about Fatima in particular, we are looking at things like the Canonization Miracle that was used on May 13th of this past year. We're looking at the apparitions, of course, and we're looking at St. John Paul II being saved on the feast day of Our Lady of Fatima. It's got secrets, it's got prophecies, it's got everything a miracle-minded Catholic might be interested in. And of course, at the shrine today, we are at the location in the United States for healing miracles. There's no other place in the Catholic world, in the United States, that claims more healings throughout the world. And so, we have to talk about the Catholic Church and miracles. There are so many interesting things, and on my website, miraclehunter.com, you'll see different tabs and sections for all these things. There are Eucharistic miracles, incorruptible bodies. Padre Pio is an example of somebody who received the stigmata, or the wounds of Christ. There have been weeping and bleeding statues throughout history, validated by the Church. And of course, the tilma of Our Lady of Guadalupe is this incredible image that science can't even explain today how it was made. So we have miracles of all types. But when we look at miracles in the Catholic Church, there are only 2 types that actually get validated positively. In cases of a weeping statue, the Church might investigate, or a weeping icon, but they'll check to see if there's any ductwork that's leaking behind the image causing that tear. They'll always try to come up with reasons why it isn't happening, and then we'll discredit it when that comes out. But it is very rare, almost never, that the Church will make any statement on an incorruptible body, or the wounds of Christ manifesting on a person, or a Eucharistic miracle. It's very rare when they do these things. They usually just rule them out. But the 2 cases where they do give positive judgment are Canonization Miracles at the Consulta Romana, which is a panel of 5 to 7 doctors that investigates miracles used for canonizations. The other place is at Lourdes, at the International Research Council of Lourdes, called the Camille. And 69 miracles have been validated at Lourdes, and that doesn't take into account the 8,000 cures that are in the queue there. So it's a great place of miracles as well. And when we look at Our Lady of Good Help, there is talk about a medical commission being established here as well. So that could be the 3rd place in the world where the Catholic Church actually investigates and validates miracles. Everywhere else there are no miracles that are validated. You know, I think I had this idea growing up, and maybe you did, that when your Uncle Bob is cured of cancer, they send a miracle hunter from the Vatican, fly him out to talk to your Uncle Bob. That doesn't happen. So Lourdes and the Medical Consultation Committee in Rome. But let's talk about what is a miracle actually. It's something that's inexplicable. It's outside of our normal human experience, so it's rare. It has some sort of beneficial results, and it's beyond the power of humanity. It implies some sort of divine intervention. Now, I'm from Chicago, and over the course of the last year, there's been one big miracle that everybody's been talking about, and perhaps they're hoping that that miracle remanifests, and that is the World Series champion Chicago Cubs. And I know you're all from Wisconsin, so you might boo the Chicago Cubs, but I'm actually a White Sox fan, so I would join you in that. But what is the point of miracles anyway? So, miracles can bolster and enliven our faith. And for Christ, they proved his divinity, and it helped establish the church. When he gave that divine mandate to the apostles and sent them out to work miracles, that was to build up the young church. Now, saints have had visions throughout history, but one thing that I always like to point out is that miracles aren't required. They're not necessary for our salvation. They aren't a substitute for faith in God, and we should look at the Bible for the words of Christ. He is the centrality of our faith. If we try to substitute miracles, we're doing something wrong. So we're not looking for magic or for wild things. Miracles can draw us closer to Christ, but they shouldn't be a substitute. So that's my little disclaimer for you. So today we're going to talk about the history of miracle investigation. How did it get to the point where it's today? We're going to look at the process of investigation. We're going to look at the type of judgments, and we're going to look at Fatima, the gold standard of Marian Apparitions, and we're going to talk about how that meets the standard of how they investigated miracles. So when we look at the history of miracle approval, it's sort of a ping-pong match between the bishops and the Vatican. You might call it a hot potato instead of a ping-pong match. Nobody really wants this. So at the Council of Constance and Bale, St. Bridget of Sweden, she had many mystical visions and experiences. And it wasn't until then that bishops started to investigate and taking it very seriously. Now, prior to that time, and that was in the 1400s, prior to that time, miracles were investigated by a local community. So the community would get together in prayer, perhaps the parish priest would be there, maybe the bishop would be there, but no necessity of that. And they would get together and they say, yep, looks like a miracle. And that's how miracles were validated. But over time, it became more serious. In the Fifth Lateran Council in the 1500s, the Vatican took over that role from the bishops. And the Council of Trent in 1545 to 1563, it became the responsibility of the bishops, not the Vatican, to investigate miracles. And that's where it stands even today. So when we talk about miracles, for example, like apparitions, like at Our Lady of Good Help, the bishop is the person who can initiate the investigation, and it's his responsibility to declare whether it's valid or not. The Vatican doesn't have to be involved. So why do they investigate these things? They've got to assess the phenomenon in the people. They've got to study to see if the messages are orthodox or not. And they have to appraise the pastoral implications. So if there are vocations, conversions, people returning to the faith, people receiving the sacraments, those are good fruits that they look at. Now let's talk about Lourdes, for example. That's one of the most famous places of miracles in the world. And so, again, Lourdes and the Consulta Romana are the two places where they do this. And they use this very strict criteria. It's called the Lambertini Criteria. It's named after Prospero Lambertini, who was an Italian cardinal before he became Pope Benedict XIV. So he wrote those rules in the 1800s, and those are the same rules the Church uses today. And when they look at canonization miracles, it's got to be the intercession of a singular saint. So, for example, You know, when we're in trouble, we ask all our friends for help, right? But in the case of canonization miracles, if you do like I do and I pray to all my friends, the saints, and hope somebody picks up the phone, that doesn't count. The church will never know who you're praying to. And so it has to be one singular person. Okay, now you cannot use bodily signs in life, such as the stigmata or incorruptibility in death, that prove that you're a saint. The rules of Lambertini say those aren't proofs that the person is in heaven. It might indicate that they might be holy, but they're not surefire proofs. And so you cannot use thaumaturgy either. That's a fancy Greek word that means miracle working. We have a new blessed in our church as of November. That's Solanus Casey. You probably know that name. I think he was born in Wisconsin, perhaps. Lived in Detroit. But he was known as a miracle working saint. So people would come to his monastery where he was and they'd say, Father Solanus, my mother is ill, or my son got in a car accident, or I'm in financial difficulty. I need help. Will you pray for me? And he would say, don't worry, everything will be okay. And more times than not, everything was okay. And actually, I've talked to the vice postulator of that canonization cause, and he said they have file cabinets full of stories of Solanus Casey, miracles that were worked in his life. But they cannot use one of those miracles for the canonization cause. It required a miracle after he died to show that he is in heaven with God. So thaumaturgy, or miracle working, can't be used. So I don't know if any of you have seen this movie. It's been out maybe a year and a half ago or so. It's called Miracles from Heaven. It starred Jennifer Garner. And it was actually quite a good movie, and I was invited to interview Jennifer Garner for my radio show, and I got to interview the mother who wrote this book. Her name was Christy Beam. She had a young daughter named Annabelle Beam who had a severe gastrointestinal problem. They went all over the country to meet with the best doctors in the world on this condition, and there was nothing the doctors could do. They told her that she was going to die from this condition. And so there's a climax scene in that movie where you see Jennifer Garner or Christy Beam praying to God, and at that same moment you see Christy Beam or Annabelle Beam with her sister playing in a giant oak tree. The tree branch breaks and the girl comes plummeting to the earth and hits her head. Everybody thinks that she's dead or paralyzed. Well, they fly her to the hospital by helicopter. She had a concussion, and when she woke up, her gastrointestinal problem was completely cured. It's an amazing story. I'm the miracle hunter. I say that's a miracle. It sounds pretty good, right? But I tell that story because if the Catholic Church were to investigate that miracle, they would say that it doesn't pass the test of being a true miracle. So let's go through the way that the Church looks at miracles. So the disease has to be very serious, which this case of this girl was. She was going to die from this. It's not liable to go away on its own. And in her case, it wasn't going to disappear. It's not like a cold. It has to be a spontaneous cure. She fell from that tree and hit her head. It was spontaneous. It has to be complete. You can't have bad stomach on some days, but not on others. She has to be completely cured of that condition, and she was. It has to be a permanent cure. The Catholic Church uses the standard of 10 years to validate medical miracles. This girl has been free of this condition for 10 years, so it qualifies. So what's the problem? Well, no other crisis or disease can cause, potentially, the cure. Because she hit her head, maybe that was spontaneous remission that was instigated by her hitting her head. I'm not saying the Catholic Church has ever looked at this case. It wasn't used at Lourdes or a canonization cause. In fact, they were Protestant. But if the Catholic Church was to look at it, they would say, no dice, not a miracle. So it's so strict the way they look at miracles. I like to say that whenever the Church finds a miracle, it's a little bit of a miracle itself. So it's pretty interesting. So when we're looking at Our Lady of Good Help, or we're looking at Fatima, of course, the thing that everybody points to, aside from the healing miracles that have happened in these places, is the Marian Apparitions. In the United States, there's one and only place where they've been recognized, and this is the spot. You're here, and you all know that. And when it comes to Fatima, that, of course, is the gold standard of all Marian apparitions throughout history. It's the greatest one. But when we talk about apparitions in general, we might say, what's the point? Aren't these things kind of strange or kind of unnecessary? Do we really have to get into these things? And of course, the church doesn't require us to believe in any apparition. It's all optional. But it would be silly to ignore the impact of Marian apparitions throughout history. There have been millions upon millions of people who have converted to Catholicism as a result of Marian apparitions. All you have to do is look at Our Lady of Guadalupe in Mexico, my favorite. And that was in 1531. In the 9 years following those apparitions, according to local historians, Modolinia and others, there were up to 10 million conversions to the Catholic Church. There are many stories of miraculous medals, people putting them on and being come closer to the faith. When you look at the largest church buildings in the world, 5 of the largest 12 were built because an apparition happened on that spot. And some of the largest Marian societies and movements have all happened because of Marian apparitions. So we can say that it's increased Marian devotion, it's spread Marian dogmas such as the Immaculate Conception at Lourdes, and hundreds of millions of people have gone to Marian apparition sites. I usually ask people to raise their hands if you've ever been to a Marian apparition site, but here we are. So when it comes to Fatima, 5 million pilgrims a year go there. When it comes to Lourdes, 4 million people a year go there. When it comes to Guadalupe, up to 10 million people come there, oftentimes on their knees. And of course, there's this apparition called Medjugorje, which you may or may not have heard of, but there have been up to 35 million people who have gone to that site of alleged Marian apparitions. More on that later. And so, when we look at the impact of Marian apparitions, there are not only churches that are built because Mary appears there, but there have been orders that have been founded because of a vision. So the Mercedarians, St. Peter Nolasco, the Servites with the 7 holy founders, the Conceptionists, the Passionists, and many others, there was a Marian apparition where Mary said, start this order. And an order from the Mother of God, I guess you better start that order. So that's happened any number of times in history. So if you go on my website, miraclehunter.com, or if you read the National Geographic article that I contributed to, you'll know that I've got all the data on Marian apparitions. I'm an engineer by training, but I've sort of translated that love of data to studying Marian apparitions. So I've cataloged 2,500 Marian apparition claims throughout history. And so people might ask, what is a typical apparition? Well, it happens in Europe. Most typically Spain, France, or Italy. Those are Mary's favorite spots to visit. The people are average age 16 years old. The average number of visionaries is 2. Their occupation is typically shepherds, students, or religious. The number of visions is usually 7, and the average duration of visions is about 3 months. So those are what the numbers show to be. So in history, what is the most typical Marian apparition? Well, it's this one that happened in 1877, Giertzwald, Poland. That's, of course, in Europe. There were 2 children, 13 and 12 years old, Justina and Barbara. They were shepherds. They had 9 visions, and it lasted 3 months. So that's the closest to the model. Let's look at Fatima, for example. It happened in Portugal. 3 children, Lucia, Francisco, and Jacinta. They were 10, 9, and 7. The number of visionaries was 3, of course. They were shepherds. They had 6 visions, and it lasted 6 months. So Fatima fits pretty nicely in that number. And of course, Our Lady of Good Help, we can look at that as well. 3 visions, 1 visionary, but the age of the visionary is a little bit older than typical. But those are just what the numbers show. Now, if we look at the visionary data throughout history, we could say that St. Juan Diego is one of the oldest. He was 57 years old. And Jacinta Fatima is the youngest. And so in most cases, there are several visionaries. In some cases, like Knock in Ireland, or Guadalupe, or La Salette, there were 2. But there's always a mix. There's no set number of how many people are at an apparition. And believe it or not, there have been some cases, like Knock in Ireland, where there was around 20 people who claimed to see visions of Mary. Also in Batania, Venezuela, in 1984, March 25th, there is this case that's been approved by the bishop in which 125 people were gathered and saw a vision of Mary. There were men, women, children, doctors, lawyers, atheists, and they all reported seeing exactly the same thing. There's another case in 1968 to 1971. I gave a talk at Georgetown University not too long ago, and I talked about the different Marian apparitions. Well, I think I was speaking to a lot of student athletes and other people who were tired from their classes because I had some people nodding their heads in the audience. But when I showed the slide of Our Lady of Zaytun, the students woke up and they began to stand up and walk towards the screen. That's because in 1968 at Zaytun, there's actual photo and video proof of Mary walking on the rooftop of St. Mark's Coptic Church. This was witnessed by millions, Jews, atheists, Catholics, Christians. It was broadcast on live television. The people there, the local authorities, thought, we don't want this happening, so they shut off all the power to the town because they figured maybe it was a device powering this projection. Sure enough, they shut off all the power for days, and the image of Mary still walked on the rooftops. So there have been cases where Mary has appeared to many people. When people comment about Marian apparitions, they say, this can't possibly be a Marian apparition because wouldn't you become a priest or a nun if you received a vision of Mary? That seems like the common argument that people make. And you look at Sister Lucia of Fatima, Bernadette of Lourdes, any of these other famous examples. But if you look at the data, like I like to do, there have been 67 approved visionaries in history, starting from the Council of Trent. Of that number 67, only 10 have entered religious life after that. So 1 out of 7 perhaps. And so those numbers show that you don't have to become a priest or a nun to become an approved visionary in our Catholic Church. And when we talk about the number of appearances, some people say, this apparition can't be true because Mary is appearing every single day for years. Even Pope Francis, who got on the plane following his Fatima pilgrimage, they asked him about Medjugorje. And they said, Pope Francis, what do you think about Medjugorje? And he said, I don't like it because Mary's appearing every single day like a postmaster. I prefer Mary to be like a mother. And that's a logic that a lot of people have espoused. Mary shouldn't be appearing every day, only a couple of days. And so, obviously the Mother of God can do whatever she wants. I'm not supporting or denying that, but I know as a child, my mother told me to clean my room every single day. So, even though the message was identical every day, she still said it. So, who knows what the Mother of God is saying, that we clean up our act. So, when we look at Marian apparitions, we can look at Our Lady of Les Lots in France, 1664. Benedicta Van Curel was the shepherdess who saw these. She received thousands upon thousands of apparitions until her death. At Our Lady of Kibeho in Rwanda in 1981, that predicted the Rwandan genocide in 1994, approved by the local bishop, recognized by the Vatican, the Pope himself, and that was hundreds or thousands of times that Mary was said to appear. Pope Francis needs to go on miraclehunter.com before he makes comments like that. But the most typical thing is that there are only a few apparitions in these classic cases, Lourdes, Fatima, Guadalupe. Even here at Champion, Wisconsin, you have just a handful of Marian apparitions. So let's look at the process. One of the great projects that I was so blessed to be a part of was this National Geographic magazine. And if you haven't seen the magazine, I have a copy to show you at my table. But I got to put together this map of all the apparitions throughout church history and categorize them according to how they've been judged by the church. And there have been 2,500 throughout church history. And of those 2,500, 28 times has a local bishop given his approval to the supernatural character. And if you saw that map, you'll see that Champion, Wisconsin has a little special dot that means that Mary really appeared there. And so when we look at apparition approval, there's basically two types. One is the traditional type without investigation, and one is the investigated type. So 1545, Council of Trent is sort of the dividing line. You can look at Our Lady of Guadalupe, which was investigated a little bit after that, being the first apparition that was investigated and approved. And so when we look at these traditional apparitions, we might say Our Lady of Mount Carmel is a good example. I bet some people are wearing a brown scapular in this audience. It is an apparition celebrated in our Roman calendar. It's one of the most famous Marian apparitions in history. It has never been investigated. The church is behind it. They gave it a feast day. Simon Stock is a saint, according to, he's not really a saint, but the church says he is. And so there's been legendary approval throughout history of this apparition. Now there have been other investigated apparitions starting in 1545. So theologians, historians, scientists, In the case of Champion, Wisconsin, 3 Mariologists looked at it. And it's a very slow process. Like Lourdes in France, 1664. In 2008, the church finally approved it. And of course, even here we know, 1859 to 2010, a lot happened between then and now, and they still approved it. So when we look at the rules, how does the church actually do this? How do they investigate? They look at a secret document that was released in 1978 to all the bishops of the world in Latin, sub secreto. So the rest of the world had no idea this was being sent out. Like everything else in the world, it's been leaked to the internet since then. And if you want to read it, go to miraclehunter.com to find out more. So this document, 1978, is the norms of the congregation for discerning and preceding alleged private revelations and apparitions. If you think that's a long title, you should try the Latin. It's just a mouthful. And so what does it say in that document? And I have to say that in that document itself, Bishop Ricken, when he stood up here on that day, December 8th, 2010, and gave his solemn approval, he followed that document to a T. I've never seen a bishop giving a more detailed, thorough approval that lines up exactly to that document. So he did a great job with that. And so the document says that the bishop is the one who's responsible for opening a case. Then, if the National Bishops' Conference wants to be involved, then they can intervene. And then on top of that, the Vatican can intervene. There's only been one case in Catholic Church history where the levels of intervening authority has happened. Bishop Conference to the Vatican. Can you guess which one that is? Medjugorje. It's the one and only case where that's gone to all 3 levels. So according to that 1978 document, there are 3 categories. One is sort of a thumbs down category, the negative. One is a thumbs up, and one is a sideways thumb, which is wait and see. In the negative judgment, I'm going to dust off my high school Latin for you. Constate non supernaturalitate. It is established as not supernatural. It's saying that it's definitively not supernatural. There's nothing miraculous happening here. And so when the church says that, the devotion should cease. And when they do that, they find glaring errors in the facts, or doctrinal errors attributed to God or Mary. Believe it or not, there's an alleged apparition that says Mary is the 4th member of the Blessed Trinity. Do the math on that, it doesn't really work out. But other times they're pursuing financial gain because of these apparitions. People come, they charge attendance, they live lavish lives as a result. That's another red flag. If there are gravely immoral acts committed by the visionary, that's another red flag that'll get ruled out. And if the visionary is just plain crazy, that gets ruled out as well. And so we look at a couple of cases throughout history in the United States. We can look at Veronica Lucan from Bayside, New York in the 1970s. Many people thought that these started out like authentic apparitions. The crowds really came. And then Veronica Lucan began to say, the Pope, Paul VI, has been abducted. And there's an imposter Pope sitting on the chair of Peter. Well, you can't say imposter Pope and hope that the Vatican's going to approve it. It just will never happen. Another one that hits close to home, of course, is at Necedah in Wisconsin, where Mary Van Hoof in the 1950s began to claim visions of Mary. Well, there were people who believed in those visions as well. But when she started to say that the faithful will be taken to heaven in UFOs, that was a problem. Again, you can't say UFOs and hope that the church will get behind it. So these are classic cases. So when we talk about Marian apparitions and other revelations, we have to talk about humility. Pope Benedict, when he talked about St. Hildegard von Bingen, who's a doctor and saint in our church, he said, the person endowed with supernatural gifts never boasts of them, never flaunts them, and above all shows complete obedience to ecclesial authority. And so we have this case of St. Philip Neri. He was a saint that the church often used to send out to ferret out mystics and find out if they were authentic or not. He had great discernment. There's this story where there was a nun in an order that was claiming to receive visions of Mary. So they sent out St. Philip to that convent. Well, he walked in, made a circle around inside, looked around a little bit, and said, I'm going to go home. I came here to talk to the saint, but I didn't see anybody. And running in from the back of the room was one of the nuns who said, I'm the saint. You need to talk to me. He said, I think we've talked long enough. I know everything I need to know. So humility and obedience to church authority is important. And so in that case, St. Philip went to the bishop and said, there was no humility here, there was no authentic apparition. So when we look at the positive judgment category, now this is the exciting category, right? When the church actually says that one of these things is authentic. So of course we need to go no further than right here where we are, where Bishop Ricken gave that declaration as the local bishop of an authentic apparition. In 2016, Bishop Hector Cardelli from San Nicolas, Argentina, he made that decision as well, that some visions happening there were authentic. He came on my radio show on Relevant Radio. We did an interview in Spanish, and he talked about why he approved those apparitions. It was pretty interesting. But when a bishop does this, he uses the magic Latin phrase, constat de supernaturalitate. It is established as supernatural. It's not a maybe, it's not a no, it's established as truly supernatural. So the key is that it's an affirmation of the supernatural character of the event. So there are many apparitions where the messages sound really good. Go to Mass, pray the Rosary, be a good person, convert your heart. If I wanted to, I could be an alleged Marian apparition visionary as well. I could come up with some things that sounded really good. But if a bishop were to investigate me, he would say, there's nothing supernatural about that. And so, you know, that's the way they look at it. And there's nothing contrary to faith and morals. And with the positive judgment, they have moral certainty or great probability that a miracle happened. The visionary has to have positive qualities, like Adele. Her qualities were assessed as positive by the local bishop here. The revelations have to be consistent with church teaching, and there has to be healthy devotion and spiritual fruits. Now, when we look at those 2,500 apparitions that have been claimed throughout history, we only have 28 approved by the local bishop, 16 recognized by the Vatican. And so the majority of those 2,500 are in this middle sideways thumb category, wait and see. Non constat de supernaturalitate. It is not established, so we don't know. Maybe yes, maybe no. The miracle may or may not be of supernatural origin, but there's nothing contrary to faith and morals in our church. So if you have a wait and see judgment, if you're a faithful follower of that devotion, you can go ahead and keep following it if you want. So the local bishop starts the inquiry, he makes a decision on the supernaturality, he encourages the devotion, and then the key part is later the Vatican may give some sort of recognition. Now, when we talk about apparitions, I get emails on my Miracle Hunter website every day from all over the world, and people say comments like, well, is that apparition Vatican approved? Well, there's no such thing, really. The only approval that you need is the local bishop, like Bishop Ricken giving his judgment. That's full approval. There's no such thing as Vatican approval. But what the church will do, what Rome will do, is they'll give signs of recognition. So through the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith, the CDF, they may release a document that says, Rome is behind this. Yeah, it's worthy of belief. They might build a basilica here on the spot. Maybe someday this will not be the shrine. Maybe they'll build a basilica on the place. Or they may elevate the shrine here to basilica status. If they do that, keep your eyes open. That is a sign of Vatican recognition. If the Pope were to stop by Champion, Wisconsin, if during his trip to the United States, visiting New York and Boston and Philadelphia, if he had taken a little side trip and stopped over, hey, if the Pope sets foot on the property, it's an approval. You may have heard this, but not too long ago, Pope Francis was in Sarajevo, and people were saying, why don't you go check out Medjugorje? Why don't you, look around a little bit? He knew that if he set foot on that shrine property, that would be considered a sign of Vatican recognition. So he said, maybe later. And also, if the church gives a golden rose to the rector of the shrine or places it in the shrine, that is a sign of Vatican recognition. It's happened very few times in history. And if a feast day were established as, if today was said to be a feast day in the general Roman calendar, like Lourdes, Guadalupe, Fatima, Divine Mercy, Our Lady of Mount Carmel, if this ever got a feast day, there's no doubt the Vatican recognizes it. And if the saint is canonized, who was the visionary, there have been 300 such cases in history, That's an approval by the Vatican. So pray for Sister Adele, that someday she is recognized as a saint. That would be a sign of Vatican recognition. And so let's look at Fatima, shall we? What has the Church done with regards to Fatima? So after the apparitions ended in 1917, they studied those apparitions for 13 years. The local bishop opened up the investigation, and on 1930, Bishop Dom Jose Aleves Correa de Silva from the Diocese of Liria, he pronounced established as supernatural, worthy of belief. They built a basilica there. Popes have gone there. They've done blessings. They've done prayers. A golden rose was given there. And the feast day, of course, on May 13th, and they just canonized Francisco and Jacinta Marto. I was there for that special event with EWTN and a pilgrimage group, and that was such a special thing to be there with Pope Francis and 1 million of his closest friends. It was really, really a big day. And of course, he dedicated his papacy to Our Lady of Fatima within the first few days of his papacy. Not just to Mary, but specifically to Our Lady of Fatima. And many of the popes since 1917 have all given their recognition to this great apparition. So let's talk about, as we wrap up this Fatima year, let's talk about the Miracles of Fatima. I'm sure you've read many books, you've read newspaper articles and magazines, all talking about Our Lady of Fatima. But let's go through those miracles one last time. So in 1916, you might not know this, but before the apparitions of Our Lady of Fatima, there was an apparition of an angel. The angel of Fatima was the first apparition. And when she appeared to Lucia, it wasn't the other two children who were there. There were other children who were with Lucia that day. I don't know why they didn't show up for the other apparitions, but sure enough, in 1916 in the summer, they appeared. And of course, Lucia's mother said this was childish nonsense. And the angel of Fatima said, pray and sacrifice. And they were prepared for their first Holy Communion. On that first day, May 13th, 1917, Mary appeared dressed in all white, more brilliant than the sun. And she appeared on the top of a tree in Cova de Iria. She didn't give her name, but she said, I am from heaven. Very similar to Queen of Heaven, right? So she promised that the 3 children would go to heaven. That's a pretty great promise, isn't it? I'd love to get that one. And she said to Francisco, you've got to pray many rosaries first. Still a good promise. They were the only 3 people who were there that day. On the second apparition, June 13th, they saw a cloud above a tree. People who didn't even see Mary saw the cloud appear above the tree. And on that special day, Mary showed an image of her immaculate heart to the children. And when Lucia asked Mary for healing of a sick person, it was granted. And Lucia and Francisco were predicted by Mary to die very soon, but that Lucia would be around sometime longer. And that came true, of course. And she said to Lucia, I want you to establish the world the devotion to my Immaculate Heart. On the third apparition, July 13th, the great secret of Fatima was revealed, of course. We all know this as the vision of hell, the request for the consecration of Russia, and that third secret, which is still being debated today, but that bishop in white being shot. And of course, we all believe that to be John Paul II. And she asked them to sacrifice themselves for sinners. On the fourth apparition, it was probably one of the more interesting events that day, where the mayor of the town kidnapped the 3 children and brought them to prison and separated them and asked them to recant their story. First they said, I'll give you some candy, and that didn't work. I know my son would fold right at that one. He would say anything you wanted. They said that the children were to be boiled in oil, and that didn't work on the children, and locked up in jail forever. None of those things would ever work with those children. The mayor took them back to their parents in 2 days, and Mary appeared briefly to them. Now, on the fifth apparition, September 13th, we have a globe of light in a pillar of a cloud witnessed by other people, not just the children. Snowflakes or rose petals fell from the sky, and there was a promise that on the next date, October 13th, a miracle would happen that all would see and believe. And so on October 13th, which we'll be celebrating in just a few days, Mary appeared as Our Lady of Mount Carmel with St. Joseph and the child Jesus. And Lucia looked up and told everybody to look up at the sun. The 70,000 witnesses testified to seeing the miracle of the sun spinning, changing colors, and descending to the earth. People dropped to their knees thinking it was the end of the world. And there were 70,000 witnesses, and people talk about perhaps this is a case of mass delusion. Somebody looks at the sun too long, everybody looks up and starts to say the sun is changing colors. We've all stared at the sun a little bit too long. But on that day, the ground and the people were covered in rain. They were drenched because of the hours of rain preceding the miracle. After the miracle of the sun, the ground and the people were all dried that same day. Additionally, people from miles away claimed as well to see something in the sky. Perhaps the most interesting thing of all, I thought, was that there were some reporters that day from the Secular News magazine where they said, we're going to write a hit piece on those Catholics, and we're going to make fun of them for getting together in such big numbers hoping for a miracle. We're going to make fun of those Catholics. And sure enough, O Seculo and other secular magazines, they released the next day of the miracle of the sun. They said, everyone could see the intense multitude turn toward the sun, which appeared at its zenith coming out of the clouds. And they testified to this miracle in the secular newspaper. So people converted on the spot. And there were 70,000 people there that day. Now, when we talk about John Paul II, we talk about him as the Fatima Pope. And it's so interesting because he wasn't always the Fatima Pope. So he, on May 13th, 1981, famously went around in his Pope-mobile in St. Peter's Square, and he was shot in an assassination attempt by Mehmet Ali Agca, a Turkish national. And the bullet came so close to killing our Pope that when he was in his hospital room, he testified that he thought it was Our Lady who guided the bullet just millimeters away and saved his life. Well, the Pope didn't put two and two together until his secretary brought him the third secret of Fatima to review. And of course, May 13th was the day of the assassination attempt, the feast of Our Lady of Fatima, and he read that a bishop in white was to be assassinated as part of that third secret. John Paul II immediately believed that it was Our Lady of Fatima who interceded for him. And he took that bullet from his body, and on May 13th, 1982, he traveled to Fatima and placed it in the crown in thanksgiving for that great miracle that happened. And at that point going forward, John Paul II was considered the Fatima Pope. Now, as we wrap up today, we're just going to talk briefly about the Canonization Miracle. Now, this was so interesting because normally it takes many years for canonization miracles to get approved. But one of my favorite parts of that canonization Mass, you may have watched it on TV, where there was a young boy who brought up the gifts to Pope Francis. And he received a beautiful hug from Pope Francis, you could tell that the Pope was so grateful that that miracle happened. And the story was that on March 13th, 2003, a young boy in Brazil, his name was Lucas Baptista, he fell from his window playing with his sister and cracked his head on the cement and lost brain matter. They rushed him to the hospital, and the parents didn't know what to do, and they contacted the local convent where the nuns there had a great devotion to Our Lady of Fatima and the shepherd children. They prayed for that miracle, and the boy quickly began to recover and was healed. And even today, he's fine. He has no ill effects of that fall from the window. No permanent brain injury. So this was the miracle that Pope Francis recognized and fast-forwarded and said, this is the miracle that will make them saints. And sure enough, on May 13th, he not only celebrated Our Lady of Fatima at their 100-year anniversary, but he declared them to be the youngest saints in the history of the Church. And so, what do we do with Our Lady of Fatima? The year is wrapping up of Our Lady of Fatima. How can we move forward? Of course, it was fun to celebrate those miracles, those apparitions, but what do we do? How do we incorporate the message of Our Lady of Fatima? Of course, she calls us to conversion, to penance. That's the first thing that she does. So we all have to look at our own lives to see how we can change. She asked us to pray, and pray the rosary specifically. That's something that we all can do in our families and in our lives. And she also asked that we be dedicated to the Immaculate Heart of Mary. That's the third thing that we can all do as we celebrate Our Lady of Fatima this year, but going forward, incorporating those messages in the years ahead. Thank you so much for listening today. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them, but you've been a great audience today. Thank you so much. Any questions? Yep, in the front here.
I've always wondered if anybody bothered to check the Chicago newspapers from 1917. It was anything written about miracles.
The question is, were there other things written about the miracle of the sun from the United States? And the answer is there was very little written from the States about it. Yep. Any other questions, please? Yes, right here.
I've heard that they won't approve Medjugorje because the apparitions are still going on. Is that?
So the question in the front is, what will they do with Medjugorje given that it's still going on? And so there are two answers to that question. One is, there are two apparitions in our church even today that are going on that have been approved by a local bishop. One is San Nicolas in Argentina, and the other is Itaporanga, Brazil, where the visionaries claim messages and the local bishop approved them while they are still going on. But now this is in the hands of the Vatican. The Vatican has never once in history ever approved an apparition as authentic while it's still going on. So that question is up for debate, but they have done that before where they've approved it. But in prudence, perhaps they would wait. Or, as Pope Francis has said, the commission that investigated it, the Ruini Commission, thinks that the first 7 apparitions are authentic of Medjugorje. It is possible, I don't know how likely it is, but it is possible that the Pope will say the first 7 are authentic and the rest are under study. So we'll find out what happens there. Another question, yes?
Do you have an opinion on Garibaldi, Spain, and then why Bishop, when there was a letter that it's pending?
So the question is about Garabandal, Spain. For those people who don't know, this was an apparition that was claimed in Spain in the 1960s by 3 young children. And the bishops have looked at this over the years, and they've given that middle category of judgment, of non constate supernaturalitate. It is not established as supernatural, so that's a maybe. They've never condemned it, but it has never been approved as well. And so the question is, what do I think of it? Well, if you look at the video footage, it's pretty interesting. You can see the children walking backwards and spinning around and doing some strange things, but that doesn't prove that it's authentic. But as in the case of Medjugorje, one of the things that people always ask about, is it authentic? Well, the Pope may give his opinion on it, the bishops may give their opinion on it, but it has been predicted there will be a permanent sign, a great sign for all the world to see. If this happens, it's authentic. If it doesn't happen, it's not. The same case for Garabandal. There's a great warning and a sign that's predicted. Again, it'll prove itself to be true, but many, many people who write into my Miracle Hunter site have questions about Garabandal. That's probably one of the #1 questions people ask. Another question, yes?
Yes, many of these appearances that Mary has made throughout history, have the people who she has appeared to already have devotion to her?
Well, there are some cases. The question was, do you have to have a devotion to Mary in order to get a Marian apparition? Or has that been the classical case? Well, the answer is no. It's pretty interesting because we think that only the pious people receive visions of Mary. Well, there's this case in 1947 in Tre Fontane, Italy, where actually a man was on his way to assassinate the Pope. And Mary appeared to him, and he decided not to assassinate the Pope. And there is actually a great photo where you see this man, Bruno Cornacchiola, showing the dagger to the Pope, and the Pope is forgiving him in that photo. It's absolutely incredible. So he was actually an Adventist. He was never Catholic, and he didn't have any Marian devotion at all. Another great conversion story, Alphonse Ratisbonne. If you haven't read anything about this guy, this is the best conversion story in history. So there's this atheistic Jew who lived in Europe, and he was traveling the country prior to his marriage. And he visited a friend of his who was a priest. And he went into the church where the priest was the pastor, and he said, "Why are you believing in all this silly Catholic stuff? Why don't you be like me and just be a man of the world?" And the priest friend said to him, "I've got a little challenge for you, a little game maybe. Why don't you take this miraculous medal, put it around your neck, and say one Hail Mary each day, and then come back and find me in a week and tell me how that went." And he said, "Sure, I'll play your silly game. I'll put on your miraculous medal and I'll say that silly prayer." Sure enough, Alphonse took the medal back home, put it on. Each day said the Hail Mary, laughed when he did. And in a week, he returned to tell his friend, the parish priest, what had happened. Nothing. So he walked into the church and looked for his friend, nowhere to be found. But you know who was there was the Virgin Mary. She appeared to him, and not only did he convert on the spot, seeing Mary will cause you to do that, I suppose, but he not only converted, but he was infused with the entirety of Catholic dogma and doctrine in that moment. He didn't have to go to CCD class to learn it all. So he became a full practicing Catholic that moment, and if that wasn't good enough, he became a Catholic priest as a result of that. And if that wasn't good enough, he started an order for the conversion of the Jews. So this was a priest whose life was completely changed by an apparition of Mary. So to answer your question in a long-winded way, you don't have to be a practicing Catholic, although most are. You don't have to see a vision of Mary. Another question, please. So the question is, what about Conyers, Georgia? Now, Conyers, Georgia was a case where a woman, Nancy Fowler, was claiming to see visions of Mary. And sometimes these happen on a small scale, where somebody claims in their own home to see Mary, and maybe their friends or their neighbors find out. But in Conyers, Georgia, thousands upon thousands of people, this was in the 1980s, traveled there to see this woman claim visions of Mary. Well, eventually, the vision stopped, and the church investigated it, and they gave it a middle judgment that said, not established as supernatural. So that didn't condemn it, that didn't approve it, that just said, wait and see. So this is one of these cases where we have to wait and see, but most likely, based on my sources, is that they're probably not going to approve it at this time. But it received quite a bit of attention. One thing that I thought was interesting, however, is that she submitted herself to scientific testing. And in those tests, it showed that her brainwaves were changing during those moments of apparition. So you can't fake that one. So I thought that was pretty interesting as well. But the church has never spoken on that one. Any other questions today? Oh, in the front, yes.
I was given this card
Oh.
by a young lady.
Yes.
Several years ago, I don't even remember, and I can't remember her name, but she was wordsfromjesus.com. She was in Minnesota. She was flying there with a priest and several others.
I apologize. I'll have to go on my website. I can't remember them all, but thanks so much. Yeah, I'll have to look that one up for you. But any other questions? One more question here in the front.
Actually, I can't remember the name of it, but it's in Ohio. Not the woman with the stigmata, but the other.
So a lot of miracles in Ohio. The question was about Ohio, the Holy Love Movement, I'm assuming. Yes, Maureen Sweeney Kyle received allegedly apparitions of Mary. And the complicated case with that one is I know so many people who have gone there and who have said, I've seen the sun spin, or I've had miracles or healings. There are many beautiful things happening here. When the local bishop investigated it and asked her to stop claiming these messages or do them privately, it so happened that it became an ecumenical ministry. They said, we're not Catholic anymore, so the bishop can't tell us what to do. So unfortunately, that falls in that category of not being obedient, so that got a negative judgment from the church. So while there are many incredible stories from that place, at this time it is ruled negatively because of that lack of obedience. Any other questions as we wrap up today? Last question. Thank you. Cuenca, Ecuador? Yeah, Patricia Talbot, that one? So there was this woman, I think she was actually a young girl in her, she was perhaps a model or actress perhaps, her name was Patricia Talbot in Cuenca, Ecuador. And this is another case where she claimed visions for a number of years, but no longer claims visions. And the church investigated it and thought that there was no proof that it was supernatural and gave it that middle category of, again, wait and see. So there's a lot of waiting and a lot of seeing when it comes to Marian apparitions, but that's a classic case. And she's been to the United States as well, in Florida, but that's another case where the church is now validated. So thank you so much for your attention today. And if you want more questions, I'll be in the gift shop. Thank you.